Hey, Read Through the Word. Today is November 24th. I know. We're almost at the end of the month. And then it's December, and before we know, so I know y'all are thinking, Lisa, you say this all the time. I know I do. But start inviting friends to join us January 1st. And to start the new year reading the Bible through. And once you've done it once, you keep coming back and keep studying, because it is not that it's us, it's the Word. And I will always say reading chronologically really helps understand. Yeah. So, all right, today's lesson is called Bad News, and we are in the book of Romans. And if you've been around here for a minute or two, you realize I love the book of Romans. And we did Determined Conference last year was all about the book of Romans. And see, I get my years confused. Was that last year? Was that somebody remind me? That was just last year. Because year before last we did it in June. Last year we did it in October, and then again this year we did it in October. But we did the whole book of Romans. And I love the book of Romans. And my kids at school are always, Miss Nance, when I say, quote verses and stuff, they're like, that's from Romans, isn't it, Miss Nance? It's like, you always know it's Romans or James. Those flow easily from me. But it is, so everything within me is trying not to launch into the entire book, and here we are hours later. But I want us to take a look at this lesson, because where we're reading in the text today has there's this clear definition between sections of Romans, and the reading right here is we're reading a lot of Romans this week, and I will be coming back to you later in the week to discuss more of Romans. But right now, I want us to concentrate on Romans chapter 3, verses 19 through 22. Now, obviously, the law applies to those to whom it was given, for its purpose is to keep the people from having excuses and to show that the entire world is guilty before God. For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. The law simply shows us how sinful we are. But now, God has shown us a way to be made right with Him without keeping the requirements of the law, as was promised in the writings of Moses and the prophets long ago. We are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. Okay. So, Romans. Romans is Paul's deep theological exploration of faith. Now, when I talked to you last week, we go by so quickly at this point. I don't know if it was last week or earlier this week. Galatians. And we talked about, I told you that I always consider Galatians a mini, M-I-N-I, version of the book of Romans. Is Paul's first fleshing out of theology, and then later, mission trips later, church planning later, years of life later, God inspires Romans. And it is deep theological. It is Paul's arguments. It is Paul full of his therefores, and we'll talk about that later. He's got many therefores in the book of Romans, as he does other letters, but the ones in Romans key in certain things. And so he's building this argument throughout the book. And in this section, so I always think, and Wendy's probably talked about this some too, that the book of Romans is divided into 5 sections. I use, now depending on, like if you read a commentary, if you read other Bible teachers or something, they might use, we love alliteration. I love alliteration. English teacher. I use 5 sections, all beginning with the letter S. And so we're right here at the tail end of the sin section before you move into the salvation section. And it is, in this section of Romans, Paul is finishing the explanation of humanity's sin problem. Now, I am reading a Advent devotional with my classes at school. I think I started the beginning of November because I knew I don't have them much in the month of December. School gets out, and so I started early, and I'm reading devotions. I am reading an Advent devotional by Paul David Tripp called Come Let Us Adore Him. I highly recommend it. It's very deep, and I wish I had it with me, but it's at school. And it talks, and the thing I read to my students today, he's just talking about, I remember the contrast of ideas that, to those, to people who aren't thirsty, a glass of water is nothing. But if you're thirsty, a glass of water is fantastic. The idea of healing, it's not that big a deal to you if you're healthy. But if you're sick, healing, yes. And so, salvation. There's a reason Paul does not start with salvation. He starts with sin. Because before we get to good news, we have to know the bad news. We have to know that we need the salvation. And so he hits hard. Paul is very James in chapter 1. He pulls no punches. He hits sin head on. He defines it. He explains how everyone, that we're without excuse, that everyone knows God, and I know I use these terms all the time. I use it, my kids at school hear it constantly from me, that general revelation explains to us that we know there's a God and we know there's a problem because that there's something wrong. We can't see him, we can't communicate him, and we know deep within us that there's a problem. This general revelation, common grace. Common grace, well, that's a whole different discussion. But we know that there's a problem, but we need special revelation, which is the miracles, the prophets, Jesus himself, and scripture. That you need this for salvation. We stand condemned without anything, but we need special revelation. We have to have the word in order to understand we need salvation. And part of that is Romans. My students, a couple of years ago, my middle school class, I had them memorize the Romans Road. And understanding our problem with sin, our need for salvation, God's good news for us. So starting with the sin issue, but here we have Paul writing to a group of people, the church at Rome, that is speaking to both Jewish believer and Gentile believer. And what he is explaining to them is that I always think that they're in the pointing finger thing. Well, they did this. Well, they did that. And all of this. And Paul's like, hey, stop. he explained that the Jews are guilty before God. He explained to them, this law that you boast in, that it doesn't save you. It condemns you because you don't keep it. And then you can't point the Gentiles and say they don't have law. And the Gentiles said, well, we don't have the law. So, we're okay. And they're like, no. Because of God has made it within you, your moral conscience, and creation, Romans 1:20, we're without excuse. Everyone, the entire world stands guilty before God. And all of that leads us into, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're all are guilty. All are guilty. And then in verse 19, or is it verse 19 or 20? It's verse 20, starts in the New Living Translation, it starts with the word for. In other translations, that's Paul's therefore. For. Therefore. Because you stand guilty. Because you stand before God. Here's the thing. The whole world is guilty before God. No one can obey God's law and be declared righteous in his sight. The law just shows us we can't keep it. The law shows us, our inability to keep the law of God shows us we're sinners. I had a discussion with a student today that was like, Miss Nance, he had an issue happen yesterday, and I said, he responded well. And I said, you know what, you really showed some spiritual maturity there, because I've known you, I've had you for a couple of years, and old you, before Jesus, that would not have ended well. And he's like, but Miss Nance, inside of me, I really wanted to be bad. I said, yes. Here's the thing. You're always going to desire to do that. You're always going to desire that. But what you got to learn is how to not let that take control of you. And that's a whole Romans 6, 7, 8 discussion. But I was like, yeah, unfortunately, you're going to want to do the bad thing. Your flesh wants to take over. But understanding that we are sinners. That's what it means to be a sinner. That the law does not save. Old Testament people, this entire book shows us the Old Testament people were not saved by keeping law. They were saved like Abraham was saved, by faith. And so the law just shows us how sinful we are. The law, and it shows that it can't save. God has to save another way. The law is not it, which then opens the door for this next section on salvation. Because now that we truly understand the bad news, we are ready for good news. We are ready for good news. We'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.